Okay, so let's talk about population ecology. Here's the syllabus objectives. There's a few of them there, so you can take some time just to read through those and go back and have a look at them at the end of the video to see if we've covered them all. All right, first of all, we need to be clear on what we actually mean by population. So it's the number of organisms of the same species occupying a given space at that same time. So it relates to how well that environment is able to support that species. So the distribution and abundance of a species in any area is going to depend on whether the environment is able to support that. And the better it can support them, the larger a population can be. All right, so one of the syllabus objectives was to talk about carrying capacity. This is an important concept. This particular definition comes from the syllabus and says the carrying capacity is the size of the population that can be supported indefinitely on the available resources and services of that ecosystem. So a population can't continue to rise forever. It's limited by the resources and services that are provided by that ecosystem. Now, when we see a population, a new species entering an area, when there's only a few organisms initially, we see a rapid increase in that population because at that point there's no limitation to the population. So it's going to continue to go up, but it gets to a point where the population can't be sustained any greater than that because there's not the available resources and services. So it then tends to plateau around what we call the carrying capacity. And it does tend to oscillate. I'm going to talk about that in a little while. So carrying capacity is limited by what we call population limiting factors. Now, largely these are density dependent factors. So what I mean by that, this is probably not that clear here, but what I've tried to do is increase the number of dots to try and increase a number of organisms in that same one area. So as we increase the number of organisms, we increase the density. And so then there's a larger demand on the resources and services of the ecosystem. So it might be a lack of food resources, lack of water, lack of real estate, lack of light. When there's an increased population, it also attracts more predators. There's an increased prevalence of parasites and disease. There's more wastes that get accumulated, maybe faster than the ecosystem's able to process it or remove that waste. And there's overcrowding. So these are density-dependent factors that can limit the size of a population or limit the carrying capacity. Okay, so when a species first enters an ecosystem, there's no environmental limiting factors, so the population starts to grow. When those density-dependent factors are low, we see a rapid increase in population, and we call that exponential growth. So it's a J-shaped curve. So that's exponential growth is called the J-shaped curve, and we see this initially, but then after that point, it tends to level off at the carrying capacity, and we call this logistic growth or an S-shaped curve. So we see that some species are able to level off at the carrying capacity and perhaps oscillate around that carrying capacity, but there's other species that tend to go through a boom and a bust. So they have a J-shaped curve and then they have a catastrophic failure and their population decreases significantly really quickly, and then later on it's going to recover again. So I want you to think about those two scenarios of the boom and bust and fluctuation around the carrying capacity in terms of our R and K selected species as well. So we see that a population tends to oscillate around the carrying capacity. And this is what we call ecological homeostasis. So the population gets a little bit high and those density dependent factors start to bite a bit more. So the population decreases and decreases below the carrying capacity. So conditions are a bit better again. So therefore the population is able to increase, and of course the density dependent factors come into play, etc. And it tends to oscillate around that point, an ecological homeostasis. So I asked you to consider R selected species and K selected species, and we see that the K selected species are the ones that tend to oscillate around the carrying capacity, and your R type species are the ones that tend to have a boom and a bust. So population growth rate is something that we can measure in a population, and it's basically an accumulation, or it's basically the resultant of the inputs and the outputs. So the number of births plus the number of organisms that immigrate to the area, new species entering, minus deaths and emigration, so leaving. So the overall population growth is births and immigration minus deaths and emigration. And we can also estimate populations using for our motile organisms. We're using our mark and recapture process we've talked about before, and we use Lincoln's index as the formula to be able to calculate that. And so N is our estimated population. Capital M is the number of organisms that were caught the first time and marked. N, small n, is the total number that were recaptured the second time. And small m is the number that were recaptured the second time that were previously marked. So we've looked at that one before. Now, in terms of Lincoln Index, there is some limitations for it though. It's obviously we're only just sampling and we're using to estimate the population, but it may be that weather conditions may be different between the initial capture and the recapture, and that might actually affect the number of organisms that are caught. If you're using a bait to attract a species, well, that actually might make species or organisms trap happy. But equally, they may have experience of being caught in a trap, or even just are fearful of traps, and that might make them trap shy. So this can either increase or decrease the estimation of the population. The marking method might fail. The marking method might make them more susceptible to predation. So there's lots of different issues with it, but it's just an estimate. So there's some factors related to ecological. There's some factors related to population ecology. Go back and have a look at the syllabus objectives and see if we covered off on those.